Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Miyako Yerrick. I'm the ColumbiaDC admin, and I'm very excited to welcome tonight Bernard Harcourt. He is the Isidor and Seville Sulzbacher Professor of Law and Professor of Political Science at Columbia University, and a chaired professor at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. He's a distinguished critical theorist and legal advocate, and he's the author or editor of more than a dozen books. He continues to represent pro bono persons sentenced to death and life imprisonment without parole, as well as persons detained at Guantanamo Bay. In 2019, Harcourt was awarded the New York City Bar Association Norman J. Redlich Capital Defense Distinguished Service Award, which is a lifetime achievement award for his work on behalf of individuals on death row. And we do encourage everyone to look on our website for a more detailed bio.
Thank you so much, Miyako, and thank you to all of you who are here from the DC alumni groups of Columbia, who's sponsoring this and co-sponsoring as well from Harvard and Princeton. Thank you for joining us. It's a great honor to speak with you all this evening about my new book, Cooperation, a Political, Economic, and Social Theory, which actually just published yesterday. And it's very exciting for me, and I will do my best to meet your high expectations. But thank you all for joining me. This book, Cooperation, proposes a blueprint for a different form of governance built on cooperation rather than competition. It offers a framework of what I call cooperism as a coherent political, economic, and social system. The central idea is that we can and do form cooperative and mutualist organizations to address all of our human needs. We can form worker cooperatives in which we can work, housing cooperatives in which we can live, food cooperatives from which we can nourish ourselves, producer cooperatives from which we can buy processed foods, educational and daycare cooperatives from which we can learn, mutual insurance companies with which we can reduce risk, credit unions at which we can all bank, mutual aid organizations with which we can support each other, and true nonprofits to serve the community. Now, these institutions are by no means new. They've existed for centuries. They've been developed and they've been refined, and they're very simple and straightforward. But what we can do today is combine and compound them into an entire economic and political and social system that brings democratic self-governance into every aspect of our lives, where we work, where we live, and all of the production and economic relations that we have. Now, I suggested that these institutions are by no means new, that not only are they not new, they actually surround us, and they're often hidden in plain sight. In New York City, for instance, there's the Cooperative Home Care Associates, which is in the Bronx, in Brooklyn, and Manhattan. That's one of the largest worker-owned cooperatives in the country. It has over 2,000 worker-owner home health aides who are basically running the organization, working for the organization, and owning the organization. For those who like baking, the King Arthur Flour is an institution that is 100% employee-owned. Here in New York, at the Park Slope Food Co-op, it's a member-run co-op market for local and organic produce. Land O'Lakes, for instance, everybody knows Land O'Lakes. Probably everybody gets their butter from Land O'Lakes. That's a producer cooperative. So is Sunkist Growers. That's a citrus growers membership cooperative, which is composed of about 6,000 citrus growers in California and Arizona. REI, where a lot of us get our sportswear and now more and more clothing, is a consumer cooperative. The Navy Federal Credit Union is a large banking cooperative with 8 million members. In fact, there are more than 7,000 credit unions in the United States that serve over 100 million customers. State Farm, everyone's familiar with State Farm. Well, that's a mutual insurance company owned by its policyholders. In fact, most of the household names in the insurance industry are mutuals. State Farm, Liberty Mutual, New York Life, Nationwide, Northwestern Mutual, Mutual of Omaha. Those are all policyholder owned mutual insurance companies, and they're extremely resilient. The median age of a US mutual insurance company is about 120 years. And of course, many of us live in housing cooperatives. So these organizations, cooperatives and mutuals, they can be huge or they can be small. They can be as large as a large multinational. In Spain, for instance, the Mondragon Cooperative Consortium, which is a diversified enterprise that manufactures heavy equipment, refrigerators, and other things. It's actually the 7th largest industrial organization in Spain. It's a consortium of cooperatives, of worker cooperatives, and there are approximately 74,000 workers at Mondragon. It brings in annual revenues in the billions, in the tens of billions of euros, right? So these organizations can be huge. They can also be small, local, a community co-op. My daughter, for instance, started her life as a toddler at the Oxford Street Daycare Cooperative, and I think I was in charge of Thursday afternoons. They can be small. Some of them can try to transform society in a more radical way by creating kind of self-sustaining, self-determining solidarity economies. So, for instance, down in Jackson, Mississippi, which you all have been reading about, I'm sure, because of the water troubles. And there's an organization called Cooperation Jackson, which is an ambitious effort within the African-American community in Jackson, Mississippi, to create a series of cooperatives in western part of Jackson, Mississippi. It was founded in 2014, and it now includes a cooperative farm, which is called Freedom Farms Cooperative, which is an urban farming worker-owned cooperative that grows and sells organic vegetables. It has a worker-owned health-oriented catering business and cafe called Nubia's Place Cafe and Catering Cooperative, which often cooperates and coordinates with Freedom Farms. It has a worker-owned yard care and composting cooperative called the Green Team that sells composting organic yard waste to farmers, hardware stores, and home supply outlets. There's a cooperative print manufacturing shop and a fabrication lab. It's called the Center for Community Production, which has a 3D printer for the community. It has a land trust, the Fannie Lou Hamer Community Land Trust, that serves the community. It has an educational and organizing space called the Kuwazi Balagoon Center for Economic Democracy and Development. And in addition, they've set up the Jackson Human Rights Institute, which engages in human rights training and organizing with the ambition of turning Jackson, Mississippi into a human rights city. So that's a very ambitious project that has lots of different cooperatives as part of it. And it's on the more radical side. It's really trying to transform Mississippi and create a solidarity economy. There are also some more conservative cooperatives like the Kingston Cheese Cooperative, which is an Amish community dairy cooperative set up to support and sustain the Amish community in Wisconsin. So they span the political spectrum. They are big or small, and we have a lot of experience with them. Now, not all of them are necessarily the best models of cooperation. Some of them have had problems, for instance, fighting against unionization, and so there have been difficult relations between, for instance, well, REI has gone through a difficult period fighting against, although many as part of the REI team support unionization, but there have been some frictions, and so there are questions about the relationship between worker cooperatives and consumer cooperatives and producer cooperatives. And these have to be thought through, but the point is that these forms of cooperation work. They produce, and they can actually kind of survive even within a kind of predominantly capitalist economy that is stacked against them. And together they can form a whole new economic system of cooperation, or what I call cooperism. That would do what? Well, first of all, it would infuse democratic self-governance in every aspect of our lives, not just in politics, not just at the election time, in the election booth. These institutions allow for democratic self-governance within all aspects of the organizations themselves. It's like a housing cooperative or a worker cooperative, where people have no choice but to govern in a democratic manner. That is usually limited to the political realm, and what these institutions would do is extend notions of democratic self-governance really across the board, into the working environment, into our social relations. So that's the first thing. And that's very important because right now we're going through a form of a democratic crisis, and in part it has to do with being trained and being ethically prepared to deal with democratic processes in the political realm. But here are spaces where there is a kind of training and education and normalization of democratic processes throughout all aspects of our lives. Then that would be the first thing. The second thing, it gives everyone connectedly an equal voice, an equal share in the resources that are produced. The third is that members of cooperatives, as a result, tend to have less disparities between them. For instance, at the Mondragon Cooperative Consortium, which I was discussing earlier in Spain, the disparity between the salary of the highest paid director and that of the lowest paid worker cannot exceed 4.5 to 1. And you have to realize that's a very low disparity in what's called the wage ratio. Typically in the United States, the average wage ratio today is approximately 670 to 1. And of course, there are much even greater disparities in particular companies. For instance, at McDonald's, the wage ratio in 2018 was 3,101 to 1. So you can see how the democratic self-governance creates some self-imposed decisions about reducing the disparities in the wage ratio, such that they're down to, say, 4 or 5 to 1. Fourth, with everyone participating with equal voice, it provides for the welfare of all of the stakeholders who are participating in the enterprise, not just the shareholders. Fifth, there's really, it has embedded in it a notion of the long-term welfare of the shareholders, and not just the immediate return on capital. And sixth, of course, because it's often local, it cares about the environment. It's dedicated to sustainability and to the living environment, especially the living environment of the people who are working in the company. Now, in part, these benefits, right, of cooperative forms of engagement in enterprise reflect certain principles of cooperatives that have been refined over the past 2 centuries. There have been associations of cooperatives, international associations of cooperatives, since at least the 19th century. And together, these associations and other people working in the field have developed a core of 7 principles. And these are the principles that govern cooperation in the economic and social context. The first is that the cooperation must be open to all without discrimination, and it must be based on voluntary membership. A second principle that undergirds cooperation is that the cooperative organization should be run democratically by the members themselves, and that members should have equal say and an equal vote in the decision-making process. The third is that the members should contribute and benefit equitably from the running of the enterprise. The fourth is that the cooperation should remain autonomous and self-determining under the control of the members only. Fifth, that it must strive to provide training and education for the members. So that's actually a core value of these cooperatives, is to provide training and further education for their members. The sixth is that there be cooperation among cooperative enterprises so that they work together. And the seventh, finally, is that the cooperative enterprises strive toward the sustainable development of their environment and communities. Now, these are principles that run through all kinds of cooperatives and mutuals and unions throughout all forms of what I call cooperism. And what I argue in the book is that it's really time to harness these ideas and take them to the next level. Essentially, a society built on cooperation. In the book, I tease out the three dimensions of this new cooperative society, or cooperativism. And I'll go through those and discuss them: the political, the economic, and the social. So I'll take all three as kind of three parts to this discussion. But before I do, just a word on background, or where we are today in terms of these questions. One of the reasons why this seems so urgent to me today is that I really feel that we face in the United States a deadlocked government right now, unable to do anything to address the great crises that we face, and particularly the global climate crisis. With a divided Congress, with a Senate filibuster, and with right now a very supermajority conservative Supreme Court, there's very little that can be done in terms of legislation or policymaking. And we're really at a standstill today. The only way that President Biden was able to get anything done in his first 2 years was through budget reconciliation measures. That explains the infrastructure package that he was able to pass, and of course the Inflation Reduction Act, essentially the energy bill that he was able to enact. Both were done through processes of budget reconciliation, and of course you're all familiar with that since you're all down in DC. But of course, even that is now no longer available. Budget reconciliation is not going to be a way of achieving anything in the next 2 years, or if we continue to have a divided Congress in the next 6 or 10 or 12, and it looks that way. In other words, with the House now Republican and the Senate Democratic, there isn't going to be the possibility of budget reconciliation. And with the Senate filibuster, there isn't going to be a way of getting major legislation passed to address something like global climate change. Now, agency policymaking is stuck itself, predominantly because any major policy interventions from the agencies is going to get struck down under the new major questions doctrine at the Supreme Court. We saw that in West Virginia versus EPA, where the United States Supreme Court struck down the EPA provisions, which were trying to address questions of climate change, because the 6 justices in the super majority at this point, a conservative supermajority, believed that it was too big a policy making without sufficient congressional direction under this new major questions doctrine. Now, with that in effect, it's unlikely, again, that agencies are going to be able to do very much. I suspect, and we'll see, but I suspect, for instance, that the loan forgiveness, the $10,000 loan forgiveness that President Biden put in place for student loans will probably also be struck down on the major questions doctrine. It's going to happen again and again. So it's pretty much impossible for the agencies on their own to be moving forward. And the result is this deadlock right now in Washington. Essentially, the Democrats are not able to get their regulations passed. The Republicans are not able to dismantle the administrative state. So it's a stalemate. And there's a way in which kind of top-down regulation of the economy is broken. So what we need really are bottom-up forms of collaboration. And that's where cooperativism kicks in. So as I mentioned, there are three dimensions, let's say, the political, the economic, and the social. And I'll take them one at a time. The major intervention of the book, though, is to argue that you need all three. I mean, sometimes there are economic dimensions to cooperation, and in some countries, the economic dimensions are stronger. So there are more, for instance, there are more worker cooperatives in Italy or in Spain than in the United States. In the United States, I'd say that the economic dimension is not as strong, but what's vital is that it be multidimensional, so that it not simply be an economic intervention or a political intervention or social, but that it be all three. So let's try and discuss first the political dimension. I argue in the book that there have been three political theoretic traditions that have supported cooperation, but that all three today are outdated because they were not made for our contemporary interdependence, our contemporary human interdependence. I argue that humans have become interdependent today in a way that could not have been imagined by earlier political theorists or thinkers, or by earlier economists or social theorists, and not even 40 years ago, really, because of our interdependence in the face of global climate change. As a result, most of our inherited political ideas and economic models are outdated and not up to the task. All of the Enlightenment ideals of individual autonomy, of man mastering nature, of growth maximization, of the wealth of nations, all of those political, economic, and social theories have proven to be illusory or deceptive, if not perilous, in the face of the new reality of our complete human interdependence in the face of climate change. So there are three traditions really that support cooperation. I would say they're all three somewhat outdated. One of them is the utopian socialists of the 19th century. So individuals like Charles Fourier in France or Robert Owen in the UK. It was a rich tradition in the 19th century. You may recall it was very imaginative. Charles Fourier had this idea of the phalanstère, which would be large housing and working establishments for 1,000 families of workers. Robert Owen had very enlightened ideas about his factories and factory towns. In fact, he opened New Harmony in Indiana on those principles. But in truth, the utopian socialists of the 19th century were really more philanthropists and socially conscious industrialists than they were real cooperativists. They were putting in place enlightened factories, in part, in Robert Owen's case, for some of their workers, who included 5-year-old orphans. I think he had about 500 orphans working in his factories. And the arguments that they were making had retained a very kind of industrialist profit motive, right? For Robert Owen, who was speaking to his peer industrialists, he was trying to suggest that, treating workers in a better way would lead to greater productivity. Those arguments remain somewhat outdated today. The second type of argument for cooperatives was very separatist. So here, W.E.B. Du Bois did a lot of work on Black cooperatives and brilliant work tracing all of the cooperatives that existed, particularly in the South among African-American communities. And he actually proposed in a fascinating article in 1935, an article by the name of A Negro Nation Within the Nation, which he published in 1935, the same year as his brilliant book, Black Reconstruction in America. He actually proposed separatism. So basically he proposed a nation within the nation for African Americans that would be built on cooperatives. So a society of cooperatives for African Americans. Now, here too, I think that might have made sense at the beginning of the 20th century, but again, we've become too interdependent today to allow for kind of separatist forms of cooperation. I think you see that well today with Cooperation Jackson, which because of climate change is creating climate refugees from Mississippi. They've teamed up now with Cooperation Vermont, up in Vermont, which is a much more predominantly white cooperative there. And so they're working together now, and folks from Cooperation Jackson, which is intended to be a self-determining Black cooperative organization, are now working much more with Cooperation Vermont because of the climate crisis, I think. And I think that that's the interdependence that is bringing about a different way of thinking about cooperation today than we did in the early 20th century. The third argument typically for cooperation is evolutionist, Darwinian, actually. And here a famous thinker, Peter Kropotkin, who wrote a book called Mutual Aid back in 1902, is very important. He was an anarchist himself, but he was writing in a Darwinian vein to suggest that mutual aid, and particularly mutual aid among animals, was far more, selective, right, or helped survival better than competition. And here, I think that those debates are a bit too meta-scientific to really tranche at this time. In other words, I think it would require too much scientific work and faith to believe that forms of cooperation trump forms of competition within animal life, including within human life. In a way, we don't have the time to resolve this because of our current interdependence. And also, what's become clear with more modern work in economics and law is that the forms of inequality that exist today are really humanly made. We used to say man-made, but that inequality is really humanly made, as are forms of capital that create inequalities. My colleague at Columbia, Katerina Pistor, has a brilliant book by the name of The Code of Capital, and in it she describes extremely well and meticulously, really, the way in which lawyers code capital. Very simple. It's everything. It's what we do every day as lawyers, giving preference to certain creditors over others. So creating capital in terms of creating preferential treatment of particular capital holders. It's very easy. There's a code of capital, as she calls it, which works with property law, contract law, there's the essentials, intellectual property law, secured transactions, etc. That's what we teach our students in law schools. Basic tools of lawyers. And those basic tools of lawyers are basically what create capital and forms of inequality. I think Thomas Piketty's work as well and his colleagues has demonstrated that the growing forms of inequality are the product of kind of deliberate policymaking. It's the changes in the tax code, it's the elimination of inheritance taxes, etc. All of these are deliberate, man-made processes. And given our interdependence today, we need a political theory of cooperation that is also humanly made. It's a choice. It needs to be done deliberately and chosen. It's not, I don't think it's going to be a product of evolution. I don't think it's going to be a product of secession or separation. And it's not simply a kind of 19th century philanthropic intervention. It depends on a chosen political theory reflecting our current interdependence. And so, as I argue, and so I thought I would just read a short passage, a few short passages as I speak with you, since this is a book talk, at least, or it's a talk describing my book. This is on pages 92, 93. So along this, to conclude this first dimension, the political dimension, we must reimagine cooperation for our times in a way that is neither utopian, nor separatist, nor evolutionary, and especially not exclusionary, but rather inclusive and open. Given our newfound interdependence, we need a praxis of cooperation built on the foundations of already existing and successful cooperative legal forms. Instead of going back to 19th century political economy, to separatist or evolutionary theory, it is better to return to the tried and true values of cooperation and imagine a new theory of cooperism for these times. And so what I propose is that it be a form of cooperism, grounded on three core principles. It is concentrated and compounded, so all of the forms of cooperation work together. It is deliberate and chosen, right, rather than evolutionary, and it is open and inclusive, so that everyone can participate. All right, so that's the first dimension, the political dimension. The second dimension is the economic. And what I'd like to propose is that we think of cooperism as a model or regime or system, as opposed to what we have called in the past capitalism on the one hand or communism on the other. So let me break that down. I think we all can see, particularly with the recent bailouts of First Republic, of Silicon Valley, and signature banks, those are all a reminder of the fact, and we saw it as well with the COVID-19 CARES Act, right, which was massive infusions and bailouts of the airline industry. We've seen it with the repeated bailouts of the auto industry. I think we saw it, of course, with the enormous rescue package for financial institutions during the Great Recession of 2018. I think what all of this demonstrates pretty clearly is that America's economy depends primarily on the United States Treasury. It's not really investor capital or free markets that govern in this country. It's the US Treasury's promise to backstop big business. Now, in that sense, the term capitalism has always been a misnomer. It was coined, paradoxically, by Marx and other critics in the 19th century. But the term misleadingly suggests that our economic system is governed by laws of capital or returns on capital, when in fact, it's the US government that determines how wealth is distributed. the truth is there really aren't laws of capital, and there aren't free markets that dictate economic outcomes. In fact, the whole idea of the free market is an illusion. It's the US Treasury that determines economic outcomes and that secures our economy and keeps it afloat. So what we have in this country is not so much a system governed by capital, but rather a top-down government-run economic system. And one of its features is that it predominantly benefits the wealthy. If I had to give it a name, it wouldn't be capitalism. It would be something like treasurism, right? When you see the bailouts of the American Airlines and the airlines of Bank of America, of the depositors at First Republic, you see that the treasurism in this country really favors one group, predominantly managers and executives and shareholders. That was the case for American Airlines, for the Bank of America, large depositors today. Did you notice there aren't really bailouts for students who are indebted? There aren't bailouts for the families who lost their homes or retirement savings during the financial collapse in 2008. There really aren't bailouts for those who today are suffering from massive rent and food increases in the wake of surging inflation. But there are bailouts for big bank depositors. And so what I argue when we think about the economic system of this country is that really it's not so much a system of free markets again or capital, but more what I would call state dirigisme. In other words, a top-down state governance, control of the economy and economic outcomes, securing it through the promise to be there when big business is encountering difficulties. I think that the contrast between capitalism and communism was, in a way, a Cold War, in a way, a certain illusion, the rivalry. It was a certain illusion because these were actually two different forms of state dirigism. Treasurism on the one hand in the United States, perhaps a form of state dirigism that seems to favor the wealthy. And in the East, forms of state dirigism that favored party members, basically. But they're both somewhat illusory in the sense that they are not so much different from each other as similar in being somewhat top-down. What we need today is something a little bit more bottom-up. And of course, tragically, this is not going to get resolved in the next elections, 2024, the presidentials, nor in the elections that follow, because the fact is that really both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party are fully invested in these forms of state dirigism. Recall that the 2008 bailouts were one of George W. Bush's signature achievements, along with his Treasury Secretary, Hank Paulson. In his first months in office, Barack Obama signed an $800 billion economic recovery bill, and then, of course, bailed out the American auto industry. The COVID CARES Act was, and the bailout associated with that was Donald Trump's major legislative victory. And of course, the newest depositor bailouts are President Biden's baby here. Bailing out big American business is just what American presidents do and have to do in part for purposes of campaign contributions. So the only way to really remedy the tilt is for those of us who work and who consume and who reside to take matters in our own hands. It's not going to happen by looking up at the top. We need to organize among ourselves and create sustainable forms of economic exchange that will allow us to work together equitably and share the wealth. And fortunately, these models of cooperation, again, are all around us. and they don't rely really on the US Treasury. They involve people coming together, working together, relying on each other, taking care of each other and the environment. So that's the economic dimension and the economic argument that I make. Very briefly, to conclude, let me read the final paragraph from that part of the book, which deals with the economic theory of cooperation. We desperately need to get beyond the terms capitalism and communism and the crude debates of the Cold War. Historically, neither term was accurate. What was really at play was some other confrontation between Western tournament jurism and state or party centralized control of material interests. The former is a system of spoils directed by the government for the benefit of those at the top of the wealth pyramid. The latter is a system of spoils directed most often by a central party apparatus that increasingly resembles what we call capitalism. It is imperative to imagine an alternative economic regime of cooperism based on people working together as opposed to these two dominant forms of dirigism. It is imperative to imagine a new form of distilled and compounded cooperation as an economic model in itself, and to get beyond the illusory debate between Hayek and Marx. So that's for the second dimension, economic. And then the third and final dimension is the social, right? And that's the idea of a social theory. Here, the idea is that with cooperative arrangements in place, including mutual aid and local community organizations, we can take cooperation again to the next level and displace the punitive paradigm that governs in our society with a cooperation paradigm. In the social sphere today, essentially, we let people flail. We let people make bad decisions. And we really don't intervene or take care of them or support them until we send them to prison. And then all of a sudden we're prepared to spend a fortune. So we hardly spend a penny to help people before, but then we're willing to spend tens of thousands of dollars per year per person when we lock them up. It's a bit staggering, actually. In New York City, I don't know. I mean, I would say, how much do you think it costs to incarcerate one person per year in a New York City Department of Corrections facility? And we're speaking mostly of Rikers Island here, right? I would, venture a guess. Well, it turns out that it's $556,000 $556,539 in fiscal year 2021. Over $500,000. You heard me. We're willing to spend over $500,000 per year to incarcerate one person in New York City. But that's a staggering amount right there. In Wyoming, the cost of keeping someone in prison per year, this is 2020, was $135,000. States spend on average, if you look at all of the states, about $45,000 per prisoner per year, right? So in New York City, $500,000. Around the country, about $46,000 per prisoner per year. At the federal level, the US Treasury pays out an average of $35,347 per person, which is per year. So it's actually $108 per day is what it costs for the federal government to detain someone in a Bureau of Prisons prison. At Guantanamo, of course, now it's about $13 million per year per man. $13 million. So we have a generous form of treasurism when people don't get bailed out, and it's it doesn't really benefit those people. It benefits prison builders, correctional officers, tablet providers, and the whole prison industrial complex. But we invest hugely when we lock people up. And of course, those investments are magnified by the number of people who are incarcerated, which is over 2 million people who are incarcerated in this country. So we have a system, it's built on a punitive paradigm where we don't take care of people before they potentially harm others or are racially targeted or falsely accused, but before they end up in prison. And then once they're there, we're willing to just open up the coffers and spend money like crazy. You know, in a way, it's a little bit like the foster care system, where we aren't willing to pay families who are struggling raising their children, but then when we take away the child, then all of a sudden we pay the foster family, right? So we weren't willing to pay before, take away the child, you pay the foster family. It's the same kind of logic that is illogical. With a cooperation paradigm, the idea would be to invest in people before they make bad decisions or before they end up in prison or jail. Altogether, these three dimensions, the political dimension, the economic dimension, and the social dimension, constitute three prongs of what I might call, in homage to W.E.B. Du Bois and to Angela Davis's concept of abolition democracy, something that I would call cooperation democracy. Cooperation democracy is a different theory of democracy. It's not just one where there's majority rule, but it's one in which there is democratic self-determination and governance throughout all aspects of our lives. Let me conclude then by reading the last paragraphs of the book, and then I'll open it up for questions, and I appreciate your attention. The age of cooperism. This is the dawning of an age of cooperism. A future of integrated cooperative projects and mutual collaborations is on the horizon. They will augur a more sustainable, equitable, democratic, and caring society that operates on the paradigm of cooperation. There's no need to wait to realize this ambition. There is no need to convince a majority of other people, no need to seize power, nor to dismantle the state. Each of us can determine, or continue to determine, to work together to concentrate, leverage, and compound cooperation, and watch cooperism grow like a snowball running down a hill. The models of cooperation are at hand. The core values and principles are crystal clear. We can do this together now. And I close the book then on these words. By drawing on the core values of cooperation and mutualism, on the co-power generated by people working together, on the political, economic, and social theory and practice of cooperism, a new world of cooperation democracy is within our grasp. I have no doubt that when the modern history of humankind is written in the next century or thereafter, assuming that we make the right choices on global climate change, it will be a story of the transformation from feudal coercion to capitalist competition to cooperation democracy. Thank you so much for your attention. I'm deeply grateful to be here with you this evening, and I look forward to our conversation.
Okay, so I'm going to start at the beginning. We had a question very early on from John, and he said, in Intro to Sociology, one learns there are three main theories. One is social conflict theory. Do sociologists discount cooperation by not giving it equal billing and calling it social conflict and cooperation theory instead? And he says, why?
All right. Well, that's a wonderful question. And indeed, yeah, I teach both political theory and law, but a lot of my work has been in the area of criminal criminology and criminal theory, and I've spent a lot of time working on sociological notions of conflict theory. And so I appreciate that. And you're right that social conflict is one of the main models that sociologists use to understand society. I think, and I think you're right that there hasn't been a sufficient amount of attention paid to forms of cooperation. Now I'm not suggesting that there isn't conflict in society, and I'm not suggesting that societies aren't riven by forms of conflict. So I think that I would say that it remains useful as a description of our society from a sociological perspective, that there is a lot of conflict. I think we live in an increasingly polarized, politically polarized country. And I think that in part, the urgency of cooperism is an outgrowth of the conflicts that we see in society today. The fact that our government is so deadlocked today, and that it's unimaginable to imagine our government in DC coming out with legislation to address, bipartisan legislation to address crises like global climate change, I think is a product of descriptively something that would fall under conflict theory, social conflict theory. So I think that it probably still serves a proper function in the descriptive social sciences. But I think that you're right that we should be paying more attention to the ways in which cooperation function descriptively, but then also drawing on that to make the argument, the normative argument, for more cooperation. So thank you for that question. That's great.
Okay, so we had a comment from Olivier, who quotes Abraham Lincoln in 1858, saying, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." He says, "And yet forms of progress, if not perfection, have been achieved and have continued to be achieved despite the persistent division in the US Congress." So why do you say that the division in Congress is new or especially marked now?
Right. Yes. Well, it's entirely correct. You are entirely correct, Olivier, that this country has seen probably sharper forms of political division, and during the process towards the Civil War, and so that's right. The House was more divided in 1860 than it is today. So in that sense, I don't want to suggest that polarization and division is new. It's not new. I would say that we are at an inflection point, or at a state, and so there's ebbs and flows, and that we are at a stage right now where, faced with the kind of crises that we never have faced before, and here I'm talking about global climate crisis and global warming, and the fact that, the fact that the Earth has warmed about 1.1 degrees at this point, or 1.2 degrees, and then 1.5 degrees is a kind of a cataclysmic kind of point. I think we're in a different moment, and so even if there have been divisions in society before, the divisions today are more threatening and more dangerous because this is a moment that calls for interdependence and working together in an unprecedented way. So I appreciate the question. That's a great question. Maybe the key response here would be that it's not that division is new, it's that our interdependence is new. And that's what makes the division so dangerous today. So that's great. Thanks. I definitely, Miyaka, I want to get to that first question that's on the Q&A, because I think that's an interesting question too.
Sure. Yeah, Wade asked, shouldn't Columbia be governed by a democratic assembly of students, board, and faculty? One person, one vote.
Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting question. And as a result of this work, I have really thought more and more about forms of cooperation and cooperatives within the educational and the higher educational setting. And that certainly is an aspiration for me, and a certain frustration with the fact that that most institutions of higher education, the democratic processes have receded rather than grown. Now, one thing that's interesting about your question, of course, is that you add students, board, and faculty, and it's important to understand that actually, so in the Middle Ages, some of the first universities were functionally cooperatives. In France, it was predominantly cooperatives of faculty members. Now, these were, at the time, fathers of the church. So, I mean, the Sorbonne, for instance, was a religious institution. It was religious teaching. But these institutions in France were predominantly cooperatives of the instructors, right? In Italy, if my understanding is right, in medieval times, it was more cooperatives of the student learners, but these were forms of cooperatives, and higher education has always had the myth of being run in part by faculty. And even today, we look at different institutions and we think, oh, there's strong self-governance by the faculty at this institution. There's less strong self-governance by the faculty at these other institutions. I used to teach at the University of Chicago. So I was at the University of Chicago for 10 years before coming to Columbia, where I've been for 10 years as well. And at Chicago, there was much more of a sense of self-governance of the faculty. At least there was a self-conception and there was much less. For instance, I was chairing the political science department. There was very little administration apart from the faculty chair and the department secretary. And at the law school at the University of Chicago also, there was very low ratio of administrators and a relatively high notion of faculty governance. So that's an interesting question. Now, faculty governance has tended to kind of be on the decline in schools, as administrators have kind of been on the rise in terms of the way in which the institutions are governed. That's certainly true for an institution like Columbia, which is a heavily administrated institution. But you do raise a fabulous question, which is, why don't students have a vote? And I would say they should. Of course, this would be radical for a place like Columbia, but I think they should. I mean, there should be one person, one vote, because it's not going to shut down. It's not as if there's not going to be tuition anymore if students were voting. It does mean, though, that there would be a greater attention to how money is raised, i.e. right now through extraordinarily high tuition rates. right? But and spent, right? And those decisions of how to raise and spend money is what cooperatives and people in cooperatives do all the time. That's the form of self-governance. So I think that's a fascinating question, something I'm thinking a lot about, and something that I would encourage. I'm actually thinking about how could one imagine starting up a cooperative institution of higher learning, right? I think that's great. Thanks, Miyake, for allowing me to take that one. That was the first one, so I kept on focusing on it.
Yeah, if you see any you want to hit, please just let me know. But given that we have Harvard, Princeton, and the Columbia clubs here in DC, we're kind of surrounded by politics all the time.
Right.
I think we are pretty aware of the fact that, lobbyists and different people with large sums of money can influence politicians who have a larger say than kind of the one person, one vote rule. And largely Americans participate in democracy only at times of election. So if we're thinking about this form of cooperism or cooperation democracy, somebody asked, how do you see elections happening? Who gets to make those decisions? Do we go down to everybody has to participate more? I know at Columbia we had to take the core. So back in Plato, the philosopher king days, only certain people have enough time to devote to making those educated choices. So how do you see that kind of actually playing out?
Yeah, thanks. That's another great question. This is wonderful. I really appreciate these questions in this conversation. And these really are the issues that I think we need to be talking about. Now, in a worker cooperative, it's self-governing democratic processes. So it means that there are general assemblies where the worker owners get together and make decisions based on a form of democratic governance. I think that it's something that is demanding in the sense that it does consume some time. Usually these are issues that are addressed in economics through notions of efficiency and transaction costs. And when economists think about it, they think of this as kind of dead weight in a way. It's the transaction costs can be high when in fact we need to get together to decide things in a collaborative way where everyone gets a voice. The transaction costs are there, but in part I think that the negative of that is offset by all of the benefits of being involved in the decision-making process. And so those benefits include first, having a say in how one is being governed economically in the context. How are the resources going to be spent? Where is the benefit going to be distributed? How much of the benefit is distributed? What does the entity continue to do? Reinvest? What do they reinvest in? What kind of equipment do they reinvest in? So there's that might be dead weight from one perspective. On the other hand, it means that everyone is really invested in understanding the mechanisms, how it affects other people, what the long-term consequences are, and takes a long-term view of the enterprise. The decisions aren't being made by a capital investor who wants a quick return on capital or who can just sell the minute that there is a profit. It requires a different view, a different relationship to time, a different relationship to the long-term well-being and to the environment. So those are often viewed as just transaction costs that are negative, but in fact what they do is they produce value. And also I think that they train us in forms of democratic self-governance. And one of the things is that I think that we're right now, in terms of the democratic crises that we're seeing right now, in part it's a lack of training in the democratic process. And so these are institutions that would really facilitate that and help with that. But it is time consuming. It's like being in a housing cooperative and you know, doing your time on the board, or where we are in, you know, old co-ops in New York, or childcare cooperatives, right? I mean, you know, all of the parents are involved and have cleanup shifts and whatnot. So there are you know, inefficiencies by economic terms, but I think that those actually add value.
So you've mentioned a few examples of cooperatives that are kind of on the smaller scale, or some companies. Nicola asked, how would you go about encouraging Jeff Bezos to even consider allowing us to put cooperativism into effect? But kind of thinking about that company side of things, very large scale across the whole nation, how would we kind of increase the level of the lower scale cooperativism that we see today?
Yeah, right. So that's another great question. I was actually just thinking, I wasn't thinking so much of just Jeff Bezos. I was thinking of Elon Musk, who, as you know, as everyone knows, invested 44 billion into Twitter. He seems to be indicating that it's worth half of that now. As I was recently thinking about that investment and the way it works, all of a sudden I was thinking, well, actually, how about a Twitter that worked on cooperative principles? What about a Twitter that was a cooperative itself? You know, again, it's not Jeff Bezos who's in the question here, but you know, it sounds like Elon Musk would really like someone to bail him out, right? What if we all bailed him out by, you know, I don't know what it would require, how many people there are on Twitter. Would it be like $10 for a membership, or, you know, or $100 for a membership to become owner, a member owner of Twitter? What would that look like? I think that, you know, we probably just need to be a lot more creative about how to do things. I was giving my first book talk on the book at Book Culture, which you all remember, for those of you who were at Columbia on 112th Street, greatest bookstore. Of course, they've always gone through financial problems, and you know, as a result of that, I was talking with Cody, the manager, like, well, maybe this place should be a cooperative, right? Of course, like the famous seminary co-op in Chicago. But I think that it's a question of just talking about, offering, suggesting, looking into these forms of cooperation and seeing them all around us. ESOPs, which are employee stock ownership programs, can produce worker-owned institutions and are pretty popular. But there are lots of ways in which these forms, again, hidden in plain sight, can be encouraged. And one of the ways in which we would, one thing that would encourage this, of course, would be some changes to our tax laws. Because right now, cooperatives are somewhat disfavored. So, I mean, capital is favored in our tax laws with things like capital gains tax, right? I mean, so there's a lower rate of tax on capital gains. One could easily imagine a system which, from a tax perspective, favored membership benefits, membership fees into cooperatives. One could imagine kind of IRA systems where you're not taxed on your membership benefits until you sell your membership in the organization or retire from workers' compensation. So I think that what we need to do is talk about them more, see them more, because really they are hidden in plain sight, and then also find ways to encourage them fiscally. And that, I think, would really help. Yeah.
Okay, and then moving now to kind of the country level, Dr. Harriet Field says it seems like the cooperation model is exemplified in the model of reconciliation in Rwanda after the genocide. Perpetrators and survivors face community trials and retribution determined by the community, and now they live together. So kind of what do you think of that example, or is there another country that you see getting close to this model that you are describing?
Well, I think that's fascinating, and that's a great way to think about it, particularly along the social dimension that I was talking about. Because I mean, I think those are situations where there's a different paradigm, a different social paradigm that's being experimented with, one that doesn't rely on the typical classical kind of punishment paradigm that we have, where we use punishment predominantly meted out by the state in trials, etc. Here there was a form of community decision making. One can think of South Africa and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission there, which I actually participated in back in 1993, working for the Motsunyeni Commission, which was Nelson Mandela had put together a commission to investigate human rights abuses by the ANC. Actually, it was fascinating. This was 1993. The prisoners had just been released, and there had been claims that there had been human rights violations by the ANC of their own prisoners who happened to be ANC members who had engaged in mutinies. And so I was the clerk to this 3-person commission. Margaret Burnham was one of the commissioners, and we had hearings, and it was a form of truth and reconciliation. And what was so interesting in South Africa was that the punishment paradigm was displaced by an attempt at a reconciliation paradigm. And certainly I think that was, I mean, you know, that was on a social dimension. I think it was successful in creating a transition to Nelson Mandela's presidency and the first years of the presidency. Obviously, there are lots of other political issues that occur in a country, and so, you know, it's not going to turn a country into, you know, heaven, but it did create a different social paradigm. It's a paradigm of reconciliation, and I think that that's right. I think that that's a great question, and I think that that's right. That Dr. Harriet Fields, I think that that's right. That is a social paradigm that's different than what we have today. The one that I'm talking about is of a cooperation paradigm. It's slightly different than the one in Rwanda, particularly because the one in Rwanda was it was community driven, but it did retain notions of retribution and punishment, so I think that what we should be working towards are forms of cooperation that put in place the kinds of mechanisms that will support people on the outside. But yeah, that's I think that's an interesting comparison. Thank you.
So you were mentioning the cost to house people in Rikers in New York, and I recently saw a tweet, and it's a tweet. So I did no further research, so take it with a bucket of salt. But I did see that it cost about $500,000 to put somebody in jail, and that cost for a year. And it said like 50% of the people in Rikers actually are there because of mental health issues. And that if instead we had supportive housing in New York, that would only cost $42,000 a year.
Right.
So there's a lot of, you know, just one more example of something that we could be doing to help people before they get into that position of needing $500,000.
Right. That's right. I mean, that's what's so mind-boggling, right? If you had $500,000 to, you know, to spend, you could take care of a person for 1 year very well. You could give them housing, treatment, mental health treatment, substance abuse treatment if necessary, whatever kind of, you know, trauma they're dealing with. I think that there would probably be ways to address it multiple fold with $500,000. And so those are kind of the ideas of a cooperation paradigm rather than the punishment paradigm, which it seems almost intuitive or obvious when you kind of just think about the nickels and dimes that we're spending here. $500,000 per person. Yeah. Crazy. Yeah.
So we had an anonymous question here. You mentioned the political, economic, and social buckets, but they're asking about a fourth bucket of religion. And so they said they're thinking of it as a strong current in a large part of the evangelical community. War, chaos, etc., are to be embraced because they're on the desirable path towards the end times. So this is sort of an anti-cooperation as religious doctrine, but I'm wondering how you see religion fitting into kind of those three buckets you outlined.
Yeah, thanks. That's interesting. That's interesting. So it's exam time, and so I'm reading a lot of exams, and I have a student who just wrote just a brilliant paper. And this student was brought up in a Mormon family, and they are no longer Mormon, and they were writing this piece out of a real animosity towards kind of religion as such an important piece of their upbringing and also the way that we think about the world. And so if I had to channel them, this literally was what I was reading before I jumped on this Zoom. Their ending paragraph was brilliant because what they were saying was they also don't like the way that people write about Mormonism, particularly for those who have rejected, who were raised in a Mormon family and rejected Mormonism, because they always find that people have to say positive things about it, because if you don't say positive things about it, some people are going to think that you're just a whiner and a complainer. And this person was saying, I didn't think there was anything positive. I didn't want to have to say anything positive about it. And this person is very secular now. And so channeling this person, I think this person would want to say, no, it's not a fourth bucket. It's not a fourth dimension. Religion shouldn't be a fourth dimension. They've actually started a secular society at Columbia. So channeling them, I think they would say, that's the wrong way to think about it in terms of not the question, but that war, chaos, etc., should be embraced because they are part of a desirable path towards the end times. I think they would say, no, we shouldn't be thinking that way. I think they would want to reject the anti-cooperism of those religious traditions, but I think also reject the idea that religion should be a necessary dimension to this discussion. Now, obviously, a lot of people wouldn't feel that way. That's interesting. Definitely, I didn't address religion in the book. I'm wondering if there are forms of religion that are more cooperative than others. I mean, that's an interesting question. I mean, all of these. I mean, I could spend hours on each one of these. We could have a seminar on each one of these. I mean, I think that the original prophetic traditions are traditions of cooperation, actually. I think original prophetic traditions, whether it's Jewish or Islamic or Christian, were originally traditions of cooperation. I certainly think that would be a kind of a Christian origin story, Islamic as well. Although there are, of course, in all these traditions, texts that can be read in such a way as to kind of suggest something very different from cooperation, for sure. So fascinating. Okay, well, let me stop there. That's maybe that's worth a whole seminar. Thank you.
Well, we'd be happy to have you back to have that discussion. So I think we have time for, I'm going to squish two questions together here and then maybe a closeout. So Nellie says that there's plenty of conflict in cooperatives. It's just resolved democratically. Yes. And then Tarek says that he considers voting more of a competitive form of decision making, which I hadn't really thought of, but I do see if you have just a couple of options, or even if you have many on a ballot, one will end up winning, everybody else doesn't get represented by that.
Yeah.
So he says, how does consensus, advice processes, and other decision-making models figure into your vision of cooperism? Great,
yeah. Well, it's certainly true that there is a lot of conflict in cooperatives. That's right. And it's also certainly true that a lot of the time when we are resolving things in democratic manner, that these are rhetorical competitions and political competitions. Yeah. So and I would add maybe a third kind of complexity is that a lot of cooperation has competition laced through it. When you think about, for instance, siblings, right? I mean, there's a lot of cooperation, there's a lot of competition, right? And it's the lacing together of the two. So maybe the best way to answer in a way is to acknowledge, and maybe this is where the evolutionary arguments also are complicated and also might not provide answers, right? Is competition more evolutionarily favorable, or is cooperation more evolutionarily favorable? In part, I suppose, what's clear from these questions and from taking a complex view of these things is that there's a lot of interlacing of these forms. And maybe the key is that there's an acceptance of some of the competitiveness and of some of the conflict, but a recognition that the way in which it gets resolved is through a democratic process with people having an equal voice. And at times that's going to lead to some people winning and some people losing, and that is a competitive, but it's that openness to hearing, the openness to working together to try and find solutions, and ultimately being on the same footing, having the same voice that matters. Yeah, thanks. Those are great as well.
Awesome. Okay, well, we got through almost all of our questions. I just want to give a couple last minute notes for everyone, which is that we did record this event. It will take us a few days, but we're aiming to get the recording out this weekend. It will be posted to our YouTube channel. I'll send out the link this weekend. We also will have a link to where you can purchase the book with a discount through the Columbia University Press. So that will also be in your email. Professor, if there's any I don't know, documents or anything you want to kind of share with everybody who attended, I can send those out as well. But if I can have you, we usually ask, if people want to follow up on this topic more, obviously read your book. But beyond that, are there podcasts, other authors that they can read or listen to learn more about this topic? And then any closing thoughts from you?
Okay, sure. Well, so I will be preparing a bunch of podcasts as this book unfolds and unrolls. We're right at the beginning. It was just published yesterday. So, and I'll try and send you links to those so you can add those to the website. There's a great source of cooperative news, which is Co-op News, actually, which itself is a cooperative. But if you're interested in kind of many of the issues. Co-op News is a great source of information. And in terms of last thoughts, I mean, I've spoken a lot, but maybe I can just kind of weave in quick responses to the last three questions that I see in the question and answer as a way to close out, because I think they're really good and important, and they'll help me close out. And the first one from Nellie Young: why cooperism rather than the internationally recognized movement of cooperativism? I would say that the idea of cooperism is to think of this at a social level, and also at the political level in terms of the democratic self-governance, in addition to the economic. I think in each tradition tends to focus a little bit more on different parts, and the internationally recognized movements for cooperativism, which are extraordinary and have done extraordinary work, and which I build on. I mean, I'm trying to suggest this isn't new, but it builds on these, including the International Cooperative Association. Those tend to be more economic driven, and therefore what I'd like to try and suggest is something that builds on those to create a universal kind of social form of cooperism, within which an anonymous attendee asked, how does the Supreme Court fit within that? I would say within which we would need to rethink models of what is a Supreme Court. It's someone who adjudicates issues, conflicts in society, litigation in society. I think that we would want those people who, in a society driven by cooperism, we would want the people in those positions to actually be cooperative leaders in a way. And so I would imagine that instead of having a Supreme Court, you would have a court of, of 9 great cooperative thinkers in a way, who would be resolving any remaining disputes. And finally, maybe the last question then, how could cooperation succeed in a very large, when a large share insists to control, right? I would say, well, that is, of course, our challenge. That is our challenge. It's to kind of show the way, I think. That's what's so interesting about cooperism, is that we can do it and we can show how it's done. It doesn't require convincing a majority of the population. Most of the other competing political theories requires convincing a majority of the population. Whether you want to have an administrative state or whether you want to dismantle the administrative state, both of those competing positions, which today really are represented by the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, politically in terms of ideology, right? A state that administers for us all versus kind of trying to dismantle the administrative state. I really do feel that that is what we have today, that conflict. Both of those require convincing more than 60% of the population, right? Because you need to have the Senate at 60%, you need to have the House, you need to have the Supreme Court, otherwise it doesn't work. What cooperism offers is something that we can do, all of us, throughout every aspect of our lives, and it can serve as an example and a way to lead forward. Bottom up, we don't have to convince 60% of the population. It can be done. It is being done. And in that sense, I think that's what's so powerful about it and timely. So thank you so much, everyone, for your attendance and your extraordinary questions. I really appreciated this discussion. Thank you, Miyake, for this great conversation. And I see you're about to have a beautiful concert behind you of cellos. And so that looks lovely and cooperative. So I'd love to be there and listen. Thank you.
Thank you. And everyone, have a great night. Thank you again for joining us. Please do check out our website for events coming out through the next months, and have a great night, everyone.
Thank you.